Hello, and thank you for joining us today. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. For this anniversary, Blue Shield Germany and BTU Cottbus are conducting interviews of notable members in the cultural heritage field as part of a social media campaign. The interviews will allow us to gain different international perspectives when discussing the fight against illicit trafficking and their approach to restitution of cultural property. My name is Tanya Contrucci, and I am a Canadian graduate student at BTU Cottbus in the World Heritage Studies program. For this session, we would like to focus on the Canadian government support and implementation of the 1970 Convention and how their own legislation, the Cultural Property Export and Import Act, has been utilized in the fight against illicit trafficking. We are joined today by the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Steven Guilbeault. Hello, Minister, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Good morning, Tanya.
To briefly give an introduction for our listeners, in your position as Minister of Canadian Heritage, you are responsible for all matters relating to Canadian identity and values, cultural development, and heritage. You are also responsible for Canada's obligations under the 1970 Convention through the implementation of the Cultural Property Export and Import Act. Given the fact that Canada has had success implementing this act with regard to cultural restitution in the past, we believe there was a great opportunity to discuss Canada's relationship to the Convention at this time. My first question to you then would be, what is the Ministry of Canadian Heritage's relationship with the Convention and how has it been implemented?
Well, thank you for the question, Tanya. So my department, the Department of Canadian Heritage, is responsible for the administration of the Cultural Property Export and Import Act, and I'll refer to it from now on as the Act, which is our national legislation that implements the 1970 Convention. Canada has been a state party to the Convention since 1978. In order to implement this act, we work closely with the Customs Official, Canada Border Services Agency, and the National Police Force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who have power to detain goods and enforce the act. The act implements the main provision of the 1970 UNESCO Convention by essentially three things, really. Requiring export permits to prevent the loss of significant cultural property from Canada, establishing import controls to allow for the return of illicitly trafficked cultural property, and thirdly, setting out criminal and administrative penalties for failing to comply with these controls.
Perfect, thank you. Second question, can you explain how the Canadian Cultural Export and Import Act has helped combat illicit trafficking?
Yeah, and I'll give you a couple of examples which I think better illustrate how we do it. The Act has a very generous approach to implement the requirements of the Convention. Broadly speaking, if an heritage object has been illegally exported from another state party to the Convention, it is illegal to import it to Canada. So a couple of quick examples. In 2015, an individual tried to bring archaeological objects from Jordan into Canada by labeling the shipment as household goods. Customs officials conducted an inspection and discovered 58 antiquities, including hand-painted pottery jugs, Roman glass vials, and oil lamps, some dating back to the 3rd or 4th century Common Era. So through provisions of the legislation, we were able to return these unique objects to the Kingdom of Jordan in November of 2018. A few years earlier, other customs officials detained shipments of ancient coins. Many of them were actually still covered in dirt, and other objects coming from Bulgaria. These small objects are typical of undocumented archaeological finds that are so easily trafficked around the world. Through further investigation, led to the discovery of over 20,000 archaeological objects that span more than 2,600 years of Bulgaria's history. The importer gave up these objects and Canada was able to return them to Bulgaria in 2011. And the last example, most recently, two contemporary works of art by an Iraqi artist from the Republic of Iraq. These works had been removed from the Iraqi Museum of Modern Art in 2003 and were legally imported in Canada. While there has rightfully been a great deal of attention of loss of Iraqi's antiquities, we should also not overlook the fact that Iraq's contemporary heritage also has suffered. So those contemporary works were also returned to Iraq. So these are just a couple of examples, but Canada so far has returned 22,000 objects in 14 different states in Africa, Asia, Europe, Central, South America, the Middle East. So I would argue that it's been a very successful implementation of that convention in Canada.
Last question. What do you believe the next step for Canada will be in terms of fighting illicit trafficking and restitution claims?
Well, we recognize that the illicit import and export property impoverishes the heritage of a nation, and we will continue our efforts to prevent this illicit or these illicit activities. We don't have to go through other states, but there are examples where we've worked directly with institutions to repatriate artifacts here. For example, just earlier this year, the National Museums Scotland returned 2 skulls from the now extinct Beotux peoples of Newfoundland. These skulls were stolen from their graves in the early 1800s. And I think Canada's museum and Indigenous people have successfully repatriated other important objects, often with minimal government involvement. But I think, certainly in the case of Canada, as we move forward with the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think our work towards reconciliation with Indigenous people, I think that the 1970 Convention may become a very useful tool in the repatriation of Indigenous cultural property that may have left Canada illegally.
Thank you so much. Just to conclude, I would like to ask you one last question. Why is the 1970s Convention important to you as Minister of Canadian Heritage?
Well, I think it's important to me, but I think it should be important to all of us. Just in the previous question, I stated that, when artifacts are illegally imported or exported, it impoverishes the heritage of a nation. How many of us have learned about our history through many of these artifacts in a museum, in a documentary we saw on television, something we read in the newspaper, and I think it is very important for our history and for our cultural heritage. So I'm very proud of the role that Canada has played putting in place and enforcing the convention. And I think in many different countries, it has been a very important tool to protect cultural heritage.
Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us, Minister.
Thank you very much, Tanya.
Please make sure to visit the links provided below this video to watch more interviews with international organizations and actors in the heritage field to learn about their diverse perspectives on illicit trafficking.